I am often asked how I've been able to move on from my divorce, especially because it was a pretty horrific one. And obviously, there's no short answer to that. There's no magic key, no switch. It was very much a process. But ultimately, what helped me move on was these realizations, these shifts in my thinking that opened up an entirely new way of looking at things and ultimately made me feel a whole lot better. So what I'm going to share with you today are kind of my big aha moments that I had post-divorce. So these are those big eye-opening realizations that helped me look at everything quite differently. So my first eye-opening realization is that it wasn't all about me. And I know you might be thinking from the outside, well, duh, of course it wasn't about you. But at the beginning, I really took everything that happened quite personally. I saw my ex in his basement office, some like Machiavellian sort of plan to systematically destroy my life. He had been turned into almost a cartoon villain in my mind. And I saw everything that he did as deliberate. And I continued to take it personally. I saw him as getting away with everything, as sort of, skating through life. I would obsessively Google his other wife, and I saw pictures of them cavorting with monkeys in Uganda. No kidding. And, here I was keening through the night, barely able to function. And I couldn't help but contrast my life with his. And, it seemed oh so deliberate and oh so personal. And going along with that, I thought my pain was special. The details of my divorce were certainly different than the norm. So I would read divorce advice columns or books or whatever, and I would dismiss it immediately. Like, oh, you have no idea what I'm going through. Yours is nothing at all like mine. Please don't even say that. And what I was doing, apart from being obnoxious, was ultimately hurting myself. And it took me a while to realize that my pain really wasn't special, that the details mattered a lot less than I thought. And where I ultimately gained some insight was actually from reading fiction. And in this fiction, there would be various characters that, of course, were faced with all kinds of hardships. And even though their circumstances were different, even though their personalities were different, even though they took place in different worlds or universes, the basic emotions were all the same. And once I realized that, hey, my pain really isn't special, it helped to give me some distance. It helped me to depersonalize the whole thing a little bit more. And the reason that it was so important for me to gain some of that perspective, to realize that it wasn't personal, was sort of twofold. One, it was part of me releasing some of the anger towards my ex, but it also gave me permission to no longer let the pain be my identity. My next realization was that healing was my responsibility. And oh, was that a tough pill to swallow. Obviously, he's the one that did these things. I called it like an emotional hit and run. He did this stuff. Why was it my job to clean up his mess? And at first, I was so stuck in thinking that the one that made the mess had to be the one to clean it up. just kind of silly if you think about it. I was expecting a man of questionable character and limited integrity to be the one to take care of me. I think I'd still be waiting if I hadn't decided that healing was ultimately my responsibility. And here was the big realization that I had, is that there is a difference between it's not my fault and it is my responsibility. It wasn't my fault that these things happened. None of that was my fault. And I could get hung up on that. I could proclaim that all day long and stay stuck. Or I could say, okay, not my fault that it happened, but where I go from here, that's my responsibility. So ultimately, I decided to take that on because I certainly wasn't going to wait on him any longer. Another realization that I had is, honestly, fairness is bullshit. That's a hard one. It's a really hard one to swallow because we want to believe that it's true. And if we listen to the books we were, read as children, or the stories that Hollywood likes to tell, fairness is always there. Karma is always going to pay her due. Retaliation, consequences always happen. And so that's what I believed. And so for a long time, I tied my well-being to him facing consequences, to basically justice. And I kept thinking, okay, if this court case doesn't go through, then this other thing will happen. Or, I just need to know that he's facing consequences somehow, some way. If I know that, then I'll be okay and I'll be able to move on. I was so desperate for justice. But you know what I really wanted? What I really wanted wasn't so much fairness. It wasn't so much tit for tat. It wasn't that he had to experience what he dished out. What I really wanted was twofold. I wanted my pain to be validated. And I also wanted reassurance that, hey, it's going to be okay. And neither one of those is really going to come from fairness. And the other part of it is that no matter what happened, to him or to me, he could have been destitute and been cheated on by his other wife, and I could have won the lottery. It still wouldn't have balanced the scales as to what was done. So really what I was looking for didn't even exist. I also had to realize that energy directed towards him was wasted. Now, in my case, that energy wasn't towards him personally because we had no contact. So the energy instead was spent endlessly researching what was going on. And it was also energy spent thinking about him and why he did this and the wondering why and all of those things. And part of that is because blame is easy. It's really easy. And so of course that was kind of my knee-jerk reaction, was to put all my energy into blaming him and bad-mouthing him and, all those things. And, felt okay in the moment. There's definitely some great dark humor that came out of it. I wish I could share some of those jokes with you here. But the thing is that energy is finite. And as long as I was expending that energy on him, I wasn't putting it on me. And if I wasn't putting it on me, how in the world could I expect anything to ever be different? I also had to come to accept the difference between a bad day and a bad life. For many months, my life sort of existed in two non-overlapping spheres. For most of the day, I was successful at work. I was surrounded by loving friends. I was even starting to date again. I was doing okay. And on the surface, things seemed fine. And in some ways, I was even happier than I'd been before because, well, once the worst that has happened has happened, you have kind of a devil may care attitude about things. But that was only one sphere. The other sphere that I largely kept hidden or kept to my journal was those nights when I would collapse in on myself and wonder if I was too broken to ever find love again. Or I wondered if I would ever be able to trust somebody again. Where I worried that my ex had some perceptions into me that maybe I didn't, and that maybe he was right. And all those horrible things that he said about me were true. And so I would have those bad moments. And sometimes those bad moments would spill over and make some of my days bad. And in those moments, it was easy to catastrophize, to say, what's the point? I'm never going to be okay again. I'm never, ever going to move past this. When I was dealing with the financial stuff, there were so many days where it felt like I couldn't win. Because here I was paying pennies on the debt. Meanwhile, bills in the hundreds and thousands were coming in. And it felt like an impossibility. But then my realization was, hey, take a step back. You're looking at this all wrong. If you zoom in on the details, yeah, a lot of them suck. A lot of them really suck. But if you take a look at your life as a whole, hey, it's okay. First of all, you have a life. That was one of those things that I had to continuously remind myself of. This one's still hard to wrap my head around, but I was told by the police when all this happened how lucky I was, because most situations like mine end in murder-suicide. And I was given the gift of life. I was given that opportunity for another chance. And here I was getting all hung up on the details and bitching and moaning about those when I had this beautiful life, this opportunity. And so I made a commitment to myself. And that commitment was never confuse a bad day, never confuse a bad moment for a bad life. Keep that perspective. I also had to acknowledge and then learn that I could moderate my emotional responses. Now, at first, I couldn't. At first, the emotions were way, way too overwhelming, way too powerful. They engulfed me completely. But then they faded. And even more than that, I learned their tricks. And I learned how I could avoid certain triggers. And so I did. For a year, I lived with my dear friend, and I had a P.O. box near my old house. And I would drive the long way from school to that P.O. box to get my mail so that I would not have to drive by my old neighborhood. And then one day, I had to go somewhere that forced me to drive by my old neighborhood. Now, at this point, it had been several months since I had been there. And I steeled myself for my reaction. And yeah, it was hard. Tears came. Memories came flooding back. I like to call it memory slammed. You know what? But I was okay. I could breathe through it and process it and be okay. And that's what I came to realize is I can control some of those emotional responses. Sometimes when we avoid things, we simply make it bigger. We make it more powerful. And emotions are definitely that way. If we can just face it, a couple things happen. One, we become more confident in our ability to handle it. We also become more adept at navigating through it. And it lessens the worry about it because we realize, it's not that big of a deal after all, and I can make it through. Now, this is sort of a funny one as far as how I learned this one. This one came later. This one came after I started dating my now husband, and he had a 100-pound pit bull who at the time was still a puppy. And I took it on myself to take care of walking the dog. Now, walking a 100-pound pit bull is kind of like walking a loaded bomb as far as how people respond to you. Now, Tiger was an amazing dog, but at the beginning he was still a puppy. So he had lots of energy and, sometimes his reactions would be a little, off the chain, so to say. And my inclination was to avoid those situations that caused me tension, if I saw another dog on the leash or whatever. But Tiger taught me that, hey, we can do this. We can handle these things. And so I took those lessons that Tiger taught me and applied them to my own life. And I no longer avoided those situations that scared me. I no longer avoided feeling the pain or the grief or the anger or whatever it was. I just let myself feel them. And you know what? It was okay. And the thing with our emotional responses is we often put more into them than they deserve. We say, I'm sad, so this situation must be catastrophic. I'm scared, so this situation must be dangerous. I'm angry, so you must have done something to provoke that. But here's the thing with emotions. They're there to be felt. They're there to be listened to. But we don't have to believe everything that they have to say. Oftentimes, they're lying to us. Or even more so, they're exaggerating. And so that was a good lesson for me to learn to pay attention to those emotions, but not worry about them too much. I also had to realize that I will never understand. And that's okay. At first, I was obsessed with labeling my ex. I thought that if I could just find the right label to describe him, that everything else would fall into place. And so I obsessively read about sociopaths and then later narcissists once that became the buzzword. And yeah, it kind of felt better because it did explain some of the things, but it didn't explain everything. And ultimately that kind of felt like a dead end. And finally, what I understood is that trying to understand is kind of like trying to pay your water bill with fool's gold. Here's why. First of all, when you're trying to understand, you're applying rational thought to irrational actions. It's never, ever going to work. And then the other part of understanding is this. I realized that I couldn't even fathom ever doing the things he did, much less to somebody that I cared about. So of course I couldn't understand it because it wasn't something that I could do. And once I reframed it that way, it was like, oh, I don't want to understand this because I don't want to be able to do those things. And I thought I needed understanding in order to reach closure. I thought I needed understanding in order to move on. But understanding is one of those things that can't be forced, like I was trying to do in the beginning. Eventually what I did is I just sort of shelved it for a while, and understanding in some way eventually came. But I needed to let it go as like some sort of milestone that I had to pass before I could move on, because it certainly isn't that. And then my last realization is that different can be better. When all this first happened to me, I kept saying, I want the life I had. And when people would ask me about possibly dating again in the future, all I could think about was recreating what I had again. That's all I could imagine, because I thought I loved what I had, and so that's what I thought I wanted. But it took me some time to realize that I can't go back again. No matter what, that life is gone. I need to let that life go. And yeah, life now is different. But you know what? It's different in amazing, amazing, amazing ways. And now I wouldn't go back even if you paid me. Because different can be oh so much better. So these are the realizations that help me move on. Maybe they've helped you realize some things too.